Well, I've been coming to this island, Ynys Môn, Anglesey, really for more years than I ever like to remember. But it's a place that's certainly rich in history and has been attracting visitors for many hundreds and hundreds of years. On my way up, I stopped off in the Tourist Information Centre and picked up a visitor leaflet about this island. And of course, as expected, I saw popular places like Parys, like Llanddwyn, and the wonderful beaches that we have here on this island, and of course Llanfair, Pwllgwyngyll, Goch Erich, Windrobwll, Llantysilio, Go Go Go. But there's another place that's been appearing on the list of visitor attractions. It's just behind me on the skyline, and it's one of those places that, my goodness, defies ambivalence. This is the Parys Copper Mountain, and you either love it or you hate it. It's the Marmite of the archaeological world. I've long been amused by the name of this mountain, Parys with a Y, nothing to do with the capital of France, but has direct links with Owain Glyndwr, because after his uprising, his local supporters were heavily taxed, and the person responsible for raising those taxes, raising that money, was a certain Robert Parys, and he was given this complete mountain as a reward. The original name in this place was Mynydd Trysglwyn, and roughly translated it means the mountain covered by rough trees, but it certainly is a spectacular place, from the size of the excavation, from the wonderful array of colours, and certainly from its incredible complex history. So much of the 18th and 19th century development in Wales was dependent on the sometimes uncontrolled exploitation of its geology. And here the geology is really something very, very special. Some 440 million years ago, submarine volcanoes spewed out a rich cocktail of minerals that included lead, copper, zinc, and iron. Subsequent geological upheavals then deposited the ore into large bodies that have been exploited since prehistoric times. About 30 years ago, I had the huge privilege of actually going underground beneath this mountain with members of the Parys Underground Group, who are a group of volunteers who spend their time and their energy exploring all the subterranean chambers underneath this mountain. Oh my goodness, it was a remarkable visit for many reasons, but one of the spectacular points was when we turned a corner and came across a mound of rounded stones. That was explained to me that they were Bronze Age hammerstones that could have been used up to 4,000 years ago to excavate copper from this place. The mineral deposits here were of great importance to the Roman, and cakes of copper have actually been discovered here. And it's thought that the fort, way over, just below that mountain in the distance, the Roman fort at Caergybi, was actually established to provide protection for the valuable minerals that were being excavated here on this mountain. But it wasn't until the 18th century that mining really began to develop here. In 1764, a Charles Rowe of Macclesfield was granted a 21-year lease to work the minerals here on this mountain. But his activities didn't amount to that much. It was on the 2nd of March, 1768, that a local miner, Rowland Pugh, stumbled across what later became known as the Great Lode. And as a reward, Rowland Pugh was given a bottle of whiskey and granted a cottage rent-free for the rest of his life. That was no small gift in those days. But before mining began on a large scale, it was the water here on this mountain that attracted a great deal of interest for both its colour and its aroma. In 1760, a physician, Dr. John Rutty, presented a paper to the Royal Society recommending the qualities of this water here for curing a wide range of diseases, including galloping consumption. He also thought that the water, and I quote, could be used as a powerful detergent, repelling, bracing, styptic, citterizing, antiscorbutic, deobstruent medicine, as hath appeared by the notable cures they have effected, not only by external use in inveterate ulcers, the itch, mange, scab, tetanus eruptions, dysenteries, internal hemorrhages, in gleats, floor ulcers and diarrhea, in the worms, dropsies and jaundice. The only thing I think that couldn't be cured was housemaid's knee. So I had to, of course, look up the meaning of gleats, and I wasn't at all surprised to find that it was associated with gonorrhea, and floor ulcers, well, that wasn't too pleasant either. So if mining hadn't taken off here with a vengeance, it may well have become a health spa. I think the significance of this place is demonstrated by the wonderful range of excellent books and articles that have been written about the development and history of this place. And this one, by Professor J.R. Harris, the Copper King, tells the story of an 18th century entrepreneur whose business skill and acumen allowed his company to control the worldwide copper markets. And that man was Thomas Williams, who was a local solicitor. And he, towards the end of the 18th century, rose to become one of the most important industrialists of the time. He rubbed shoulders with people like Boulton and Watt and John Wilkinson. In every sense of the business word, he was a quite remarkable man. Indeed, Matthew Boulton described Thomas Williams as the Copper King. And the scale of these workings give an indication of just the significance of Thomas Williams's business activities at the end of the 18th century. He was described by a contemporary as being penetrating in his judgment, pertinacious in his views, and decisive in his measures. He lost little time balancing different opinions as to their eligibility, and still less in carrying them into effect. He must have been one heck of a man to work with and for. Such was his influence that he had made and circulated his own coinage to pay his workpeople. But there's another view of Thomas Williams's character, which was written by James Watt in 1790. And James said, "Let me advise you to be extremely cautious in your dealings with W, Williams that is. He is a perfect tyrant and not over tenacious in his word, and will screw damned hard when he's got anyone in his vice." So perhaps he didn't wholly deserve his nickname Tum Chwaraeteg, that is, Tom Fair Play, yet the local people sang loudly in his praises because he supported local poor children and in the repair and rebuilding of the local church. Copper was really such an important commodity at that time for so many various uses, but especially as far as the British Navy was concerned, because those ocean-going wooden ships were affected by marine growth, by boring worms, etc., and copper was used to produce sheets to be placed on the underside of the ships, which certainly increased their speed and their manoeuvrability. Hence the term a copper bottom deal. During Thomas Williams's reign, this huge pit was expanded and deepened using, explosives and sheer muscle power. So many contemporary tourists and visitors came here, and they were almost all, without exception, really impressed with the scale and intensity of the mining activity here. So often, when you explore places like this, these industrial complexes in Wales, you don't get much idea of what life was like for the people who actually worked here, the miners. And it's only when you get into this environment and you see the scale and you see the amount of waste tips and you see the whole intensity of the industry that you start to begin to realize a little bit about their working conditions. We know, for instance, that here they worked what were called as bargain takers. That is, a group of men would negotiate with the management to excavate a given amount of ore from a particular area of rock, and for that then they were paid accordingly. And so what could happen was that one of the men might then decide that he was going to employ subcontractors, and so that's the way the whole hierarchy of excavation and mining activity took place here. A bargain taker could earn between 4 and 6 shillings a day, and a rough calculation that works out about £27–29 as a daily rate by modern terms. We get an indication of what the working conditions were like from the account left by William Bingley, who visited in 1798. He wrote a really vivid account, a marvellous description of these mines. It's quite long, so just bear with me. And this is what he said. He was probably standing on the top of the edge up there behind me, and he said, "I found myself standing on the verge of a vast and tremendous chasm. I stepped onto one of the stages, suspended over the edges of the steep, and the prospect was dreadful. The number of caverns at different heights along the sides, the broken and irregular masses of rock, the multitudes of men working at different parts and apparently in the most perilous situations, the noise of the picking of the oars from the rock and the hammering of the wadding when it was about to be blasted, with, at intervals, the roar of the blasts in different parts of the mine, all together excited the most sublime ideas intermixed with sensations of terror." Once the rock had been mined, the next stage was to break it down into manageable lumps, about the size of a hen or duck's egg. And this was the job of a remarkable group of ladies known as the Copper Ladies, and they worked in single-story buildings, up to 80 at a time, and their job was using a 4-pound hammer to smack the rock, to break the rock down into workable ore lumps, and they did that against what was known as a knockstone, a large block of iron. But to protect their rock-holding hand, as it were, they wore leather gauntlets that were sheathed with iron and iron rings. And for that job, they worked 12 hours a day, and their money was 12 pence a day. Their dress was described in great detail. They wore black hats and yellow spotted scarves that were evidently tied very tightly down around their head, protecting their hair, and they wore long leather aprons to protect their clothes. Once the ore had been separated, it was then roasted either in the open or in large kilns, and we're very fortunate here on Parys Mountain because so many people came and visited in the 18th and early 19th century. They've left us a huge amount of information as to what went on here. Here's another quote by Thomas Pennant in 1784, and he left us this very graphic description. He said, "Suffocating fumes of burning heaps of copper arise in all parts and extend their baleful influence. Even the mosses and lichens have perished, and nothing seems capable of resisting the fumes for miles around." And one of the most unusual features are these pits where scrap iron was placed, and then the pits were filled with water that had been pumped out of the mine. But then it may have taken a few weeks or perhaps months, but eventually all the iron was dissolved, leaving behind a sludgy precipitate of copper. The old adage, location, 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 was certainly very appropriate as far as the copper mine here on Parys Mountain was concerned, because its proximity to the sea was crucial to its success. This place, Amlwch Port, is just a few miles away from Parys Copper Mountain, and in the mid-18th century it was described as a narrow cove between two steep rocks. Yet, as explained in Brian Hope's excellent book, A Curious Place, this tiny gulch became one of the most important places of industry and shipbuilding in 18th century Wales. Huge quantities of copper were brought in from Paris and elsewhere to be smelted here alongside this port. And in the 18th century, as a consequence, well, it expanded exponentially. By the 1780s into the 1790s, it was recorded that there were over 100 brigantines, sloops, etc., importing and exporting copper from this port. So it really was a fantastically busy place. And also records describe how the harbour was absolutely chock-a-block with boats, so they could hardly move. It's little wonder then that the pressure on this port demanded improvements and expansion, and that was achieved after an Act of Parliament in 1793. What's really impressive by any standard was the intensity and rapidity of industrialization here in this small harbour and its neighbouring town of Amlwch. Within this small area, there was an intense concentration of activity that included copper smelting works, vitriol and sulphur production, lime kilns, a whole array of industrial activity. As the copper supplies from the mountain were declining, well, so they were importing copper ore into the smelters here, keeping this activity going. Eventually, of course, copper smelting ended here in and around this port, but that wasn't the end of the story, because towards the middle and in latter years of the 19th century, Amlwch developed into one of the most important shipbuilding and repair centres in the whole of this coast along North Wales. And just behind me, that cutting into the rock there, where we can see where once the dock gates were located, that was one of the shipbuilding yards. And one of the main people behind that period of development was another local man, William Thomas. He was born in 1822. He went to sea at the age of 12, and for years nothing was ever heard from him or known about what he was up to. Quite a remarkable man, because by the age of 27 he was a sea captain. And he with his sons saw this port expand and develop until it was reaching its heyday in the early years of the 20th century. This lime kiln makes a perfect vantage point to see the whole spread of the port, from the windmill on the headland just there, the copper ore bins behind me there, and of course the watch house, and then behind me on the hill the sail loft, where those great sails for those wonderful sailing ships were made and repaired. When exploring places like this, I'm always on the lookout for the little details, like the loo that we can see just across the other side of the harbour. Now that's a place I think I would have probably avoided when there was a high tide combined with a howling northwesterly gale. But I just love this. Here in this watch house that was built in 1853, we have this wonderful fossil, which is a fish with its eggs dating back millions and millions of years. It rather puts history into perspective. If you want to know more about the really complex geology of this area, well, this is the place to visit, the Geomon Visitor Centre. So, towards the end of the 18th century, Amlwch, the port and the town, well, it was the second largest in Wales at the time. And looking at this interpretation panel, we just get some idea of the kind of things that were going on here. So, we have a brewery, paint store, shipyard, sail loft, what else do we have? Warehouse, sawmills. Gosh, there's just an amazing array of activities, and of course lots and lots and lots of pubs. It's been estimated that there might have been up to 21 pubs in this town, but then other people have thought that there were many more because so many houses had their own brewing facilities. But the quality of the beer in this place, one account says, well, it was of rather dubious quality, and so the dregs thrown onto the floor or thrown out into the gutter, where the local pigs indulged themselves. And there was a lovely quote: the pigs lived their lives in blithe intoxication. I just wonder what the bacon tasted like. Yet Arthur Aitken, he was one of the many visitors to this town, came here in 1797, and he wrote very favourably about the manners, the sobriety and general good behaviour of the population. Indeed, he was at pains to express his impressions of a Sunday in the town. And here's another quote. Here it is. He says, "We observed a circle of men gathered round a point of rock, on which was seated the orator of the party, reading a newspaper aloud and commenting on it. Then Aitken's group, they passed on, and I quote again, a large company of lads and lasses seated on a green bank, chatting, laughing, and full of mirth and frolic." The demise of copper smelting in the port, the tradition of chemical processing, continued with the establishment of the Associated Octel Bromide Works. It began in the early 1950s and ran successfully for over 50 years, employing over 100 people in its heyday. But with changing technology, demands for its products dropped, and it closed in 2004. And the connection with the motor industry continued and resulted in the construction of these concrete piers and wharfs behind me, because that was part and parcel of the Shell offshore oil terminal, when super tankers were bringing in the oil and discharging it inland not far from here. And that too has now gone. Industry, both in the port and here on the mountain, has of course fluctuated over the years, but there are still valuable minerals beneath my feet, and who knows, if the price is right, we may see them being developed and exploited again. I first came to this mountain in 1967, and at that time the bottom of the pit was filled with water polluted, absolutely disgusting water. You can still see traces of the car tyres that have been dumped in the bottom there, but this whole place was covered with rubbish, and there were proposals to demolish the whole lot, fill in the tip, level all the buildings. And what a shame that would have been, because had we done so, we'd have lost the archaeological and historic evidence about a really remarkable period of industrial development in Wales. This is now a very popular place, and I'm so pleased to see these really excellent information panels that tell us so much about what we can see here on this mountain, including the windmill, the beam engine house, and of course the other structures. So much of the information, well, that's been produced by really marvellous groups of volunteers, including the Amlwch Industrial Heritage Trust and the Parys Underground Group. And between them, they have found out so much to help us understand the complexity and the sheer excitement of what went on here on Parys and down in the port of Amlwch. This whole place is pretty amazing, and I think it's just staggering how important it was in terms of copper mining in Wales. But not only in Wales, because what went on here on Parys Mountain and down in the port in Amlwch, well, as we know, at one time controlled the worldwide copper markets.